Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a very good lunch. And welcome to this session, which is Automating SharePoint Governance and Management. My name is Dan Holm, and for those of you who are not at my previous session, let me give you a quick introduction to me. And for those of you who were at the previous session, I apologize for the repeat. But my name is Dan Holm. I'm an MVP in SharePoint Server for the last 6 years. And I am the Chief SharePoint Evangelist for AvePoint, which is one of the largest SharePoint ISVs. I travel around the world, and my job is to help customers succeed with SharePoint. And so I'm generally working with very large customers, although we also have customers that are small and medium businesses, facing very common challenges. In this case, how to reduce cost and increase responsiveness to the business by automating governance and automation processes. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, of course. When I'm not with customers, I live in Maui, Hawaii, so I just thought I'd share a couple of quick pictures of home with you. And I also serve as the Microsoft Technologies consultant for NBC during the broadcast of the Olympic Games. So we're in the process of setting up our SharePoint environment for London right now. I also am an author and wrote the SharePoint 2010 training kit, in which you'll find all kinds of great references to PowerShell commandlets of the types we're going to be working with today. Probably the most important information on this slide, for those of you who did not get this in the previous session, is my email address. Please don't hesitate to write if you've got questions about today's session or about anything in SharePoint in general. And with that, let's dive into the main topic, which is automating governance and management. Now, I want to start with a very quick overview of governance. Again, this is a small repeat for those of you who were in the previous session, but we're going to go through this quite quickly here. The role of governance in SharePoint, and really in any service, is to define processes, people, policies, and technologies that deliver that service. And as we talked about in the previous session, it's all about taking business needs and making them work on a service. Now, a service in IT is generally managed by IT. So the management layer is all about operations. It's about deployment, administration, configuration, and troubleshooting of the service. And governance sits as at the layer between business and management to take business requirements and translate those into policies and requirements for the service. So basically, governance's job is to act as a communication channel between the business and the management of the particular service. And this particular slide illustrates that as well, which is in a governance scenario, you're taking business requirements, translating those into what I would call policies about what must be done in the service. And then management's job is to actually apply those policies into the service as part of day-to-day operations. And this is the part that gets particularly painful and expensive for a lot of organizations because SharePoint is a very intensive service to administer. If your business is active in what it's asking your service to support, administrators are going to have to spend a lot of time creating sites, adding groups, managing users, applying permissions, and then there's also the site collection administrator role. And site collection administrators are the ones who are responsible for maintaining the content within a site collection, creating lists and libraries, managing content types, all of those kinds of things. And in many IT organizations, well, let me say this, Microsoft designed the site collection administrator role to really be one performed by the power user, by the business owner of the content. So the concept is that business owners, power users are site collection administrators, and IT is really just there until the site collection is created. What I see as a reality in most organizations is that IT is also having to be the site collection administrator. They're the ones having to be in there performing tasks like creating groups, assigning permissions, creating content types and such. And in your organizations, how many of you would say that IT spends more time than power users actually being site collection administrators? Yeah, okay, that's sort of reflects my experience. Well more than half of the organizations I see are in that position. And so what we want to try to do as an enterprise is automate as many of the tasks as possible. This is a fairly new set of demands that's rising in the SharePoint world, the idea of actually automating operations. But it's not new from a conceptual perspective. Before I came to SharePoint, I worked with Active Directory since 1998, actually, when it was in alpha. And during the early days of Active Directory, people were learning how to architect it. They were learning how to align it with their business requirements. And then in about 2002, 2003, people started saying, okay, we figured it out. Now we need to automate it so that our administrators can focus on the next big thing, which maybe it may have been Exchange 2003, for example. And as Active Directory matured, the architecture became less of an issue, and the management and automation of operations became more important. And that's where we're starting to see things happen in SharePoint, where the service is starting to be big enough, and organizations are starting to understand it to a level where they want to provide more service to the business and yet keep costs down by automating those operations. So what we're going to try to do today is show you the pieces that are necessary in order to automate operations of SharePoint. Now, this is a brand new presentation, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we're going to approach it. The goal of this session is to help you understand the pieces you have to put together to automate operations. And I'm certainly hopeful that by the time we're done, we will have automated some operations in some very interesting ways. This session is not designed to solve every problem for you, because that's just simply not possible in an hour and a half, an hour and 15 minutes. It's also very reliant on PowerShell. So I'm going to have to assume that you have at least a little bit of knowledge of PowerShell, although I will be explaining it as we go. So if you are new to PowerShell, don't be scared. And as long as you're not scared, you'll be okay. But I'm not going to go into tons of detail on PowerShell. I'm going to be focusing on the use of PowerShell. I also am not going to be focused on pure, elegant scripting in PowerShell, because there are certain things you can do in PowerShell that make it very close to programming, as far as creating functions and doing all sorts of really cool, slick ways of scripting. I don't want to worry about that, because that's more about PowerShell than it is about automating operations in SharePoint. So we're going to create scripts that are effective, that get the job done, that help you really understand how to tie together the concepts. But these scripts aren't necessarily going to be beautiful, and they're also not necessarily going to be perfectly scalable. So we're not going to talk about how you would apply these scripts in an organization with 400,000 users, but you're going to be able to take these concepts, give them to one of your scripters, and have them make it pretty and scalable, because scalability is really just an issue of being more efficient in the script. So that's how we're going to approach it. There's one other interesting twist to this session, and that is I had a really, really, really bad virtual machine crash. And so everything I had prepared had pretty much gotten wiped out. And during lunch, and the joy of being 25,000 miles from home, during lunch I rebuilt as much as I can, and I think I've pretty much got it running. But we're going to it's going to be more real world than I expected. We're actually going to, so we might even get some additional lessons out of this. So if there are a few rough edges, I apologize in advance, but I can definitely guarantee you're going to get some really interesting ideas out of this. Because when I've done this with the Active Directory teams over the years, this is something that really makes them open their eyes and go, wow, this is easier than I thought. And I can start investing in some of these tools now, investing time, because they are free of cost, really. And some of these things may help you create solutions that might reduce your total cost of ownership of SharePoint as far as not needing other tools in your environment. So we're going to dive right in, and we're going to start with an example of creating sites. Because that's something that happens all the time. So businesses need to create sites for collaboration. And of course, many of you were in the last session, and we sort of talked about the fact that in a collaborative environment, each unit of collaboration really needs to be a site collection. We used the example of departments in the last session, but it also might be a team or a project or a process, as some people were talking about just before lunch. So each unit needs a site collection, and creating site collections is something where typically users will call the help desk will create a ticket, and an administrator will go and click through things. And that's okay if all you need to do is to create a site collection. But what if you also have other governance requirements that have come down the line about what that site collection needs to be? For example, I recommend as a best practice that whenever you have a document library with versioning enabled, you set version retention limits. Because if you don't, the previous versions can really badly bloat your storage burden. So governance may have provided some guidelines about how many versions you need to maintain for a team site. You might also have decided that it's a best practice when you have a document library to enforce checkout. Because checkout is a great feature in SharePoint, but it's not enforced by default, which means even when you set up a document library, two users might make changes that conflict with each other. Simple to solve by simply enabling checkout. If that is one of your policies and you're creating the site collection by hand, manually, then each time you create a site collection, you're having to go to the document library and enable checkout and set version retention and blah, blah, blah. Those are the kinds of things that we also want to collect into the site creation process. So we want our site to reflect all of the policies that have come to us from our governance. So we're going to begin with the PowerShell commands that actually create a site, and we're going to do this manually, and then we're going to build up to PowerShell and to an automated, very cool process, I hope. So let's see here. Get my virtual machine going here. And getting old, so I need my glasses to do the hard work. So we're going to work in PowerShell. So I've got the SharePoint management shell here. And the command that allows us to create, actually let me get rid of some windows here just to make it cleaner. The command that allows us to create a new site collection is new SP site. Now, if you're newer to PowerShell, it is important to realize that PowerShell uses .NET object names for SharePoint components instead of names that are used in the user interface. So in the user interface, you create a new site collection. But into .NET, to the underlying code base, that's actually called an SP site. So, so a site is a site collection. In the user interface, what is a site is actually an SP web in PowerShell, just to make things confusing for our IT pros. So new SP site is the command that we need to use, and as a quick tip for those of you who are a little bit newer to PowerShell, you can always use the get help command to get help about a particular command, what it does, and the switches that it takes. Now the key switches that we're going to use are here on the slide, so that's a little bit easier to look at. We're going to specify the URL of the site collection that we are going to create. We optionally can specify a content database to put that site in. We specify the descriptive name of the site. And then you're required to provide the primary site collection administrator. So the primary site collection administrator in PowerShell and .NET language is the owner alias property, which has a domain / username format. Last but not least, you need to specify the name of the template that you want to apply to the site. Now, the site collection templates are listed using the get spweb template command. So with those things in mind, let's jump in and take a look. Let's say we're going to create a team site. We know we're going to need to specify the web template for that site collection. So we use the get spweb template command. It lists out all of the available templates. And if we zoom in here, we see that STS0 is the team site. So that's the code name for the team site template. We'll need to remember that for our use in a moment here. Then we start with new SP site. So new SP site starts with the URL of the site collection. All of our team sites are in a web application called teams.contoso.com, and then I have a managed path created called Teams, and so the new site collection goes underneath that. And let's say that this new team is collaborating on Tech Days, so we'll call it Tech Days. So that's the URL. Now, optionally, we can specify the content database that this site collection goes into, which is something you can't do in the user interface. In the user interface, SharePoint makes its own decision about which content database the site collection is going to go into. Here, we could, if we wanted to, specify that. I'm going to skip that for the moment, though. And then we specify the descriptive name of the site collection, so that would be the -name parameter. And we'll call this Tech Days 2012 BE. And then the owner alias, Contoso SP admin. And you can also specify the secondary owner. So as you know, in central administration, when you create a site collection, you've got the primary and the secondary site collection administrator. This is one of the things that I think governance needs to help specify in your organization, is who are the primary and secondary site collection administrators. The primary and secondary site collection administrators are part of the object that's shown in central administration. There can only be two, primary and secondary. Now, as you know from the SharePoint user interface, you can go into the site collection administrators group in a site collection, and you can add as many site collection administrators as you want. Those site collection administrators are actually a different property. They're called the same thing, but they're actually different. These are called owners, and these are called site collection administrators. So you can have two owners and as many site collection administrators as you want. Now, the difference is that those owners get email notifications. So if you've set up email notifications that the site is getting too large and is reaching its quota, or that it's old and needs to be deleted, the two owners get those email notifications. But the owners, and as listed in central administration, and the site collection administrators have full control of all the content. So they all have full control. The owners, the two owners, get the email. And in the command line, you can specify the two owners. So we'll go ahead and start with one owner here. And then the final parameter we'll use is the template parameter. And remember, that was STS#0. So from the command line, if I type this correctly, this should create a team site for us for Tech Days. And we'll give it a second and let that do that. It looks like it's working. That's a good sign. Now, while that's working in the background, I want to point out the bottom command. If one of the governance object, one of the architectural components of SharePoint that we did not talk about in the previous section was content databases. You have the option in a web application of having one or more content databases. Each content database can have one or more site collections in it. By default, the way SharePoint works is when you create a web application, you get one content database and all the site collections go into it. And that's the default. That's the easy way. The problem with that is if you put a lot of site collections into a single content database, that content database gets large, and so backing it up and restoring it takes more time. In addition, you can start running into other performance and service-related issues. So it's a relatively good idea to consider splitting site collections into content databases to reflect your storage management goals for those site collections. So if you have 10 teams, and 8 of the teams are fine with being backed up every night, and 2 of the teams need to be backed up every hour, I would suggest putting those in 2 separate site collections in order to support that management goal. And to create a new content database, you use the new SP content database commandlet. You give it the content database a name, and you assign it to a web application. So that would allow us to create a content database that we then can put a new site collection into when we run the new SP site commandlet. Now, if we've done everything, if we've been lucky, we have a new site collection. And sure enough, PowerShell has dumped the default property of the new site collection, which is its URL. So if we open that site collection up, we should be able to see it. So let's go to teams.contoso.com/teams/techdays. So the site collection is created. Now let's review some of those governance-related settings that I was talking about. One of the settings that I mentioned was the idea of enforcing checkout and version retention limits in your shared documents document library. So if we go into the shared documents document library, go into library settings in the UI, we can go into versioning settings, and we can enable versioning, either major or major and minor, And if we do enable versioning, it's definitely a best practice to set some kind of version retention limit. So this would have to come from governance, and it would be probably driven significantly by legal about how many versions you're going to keep. But let's just assume we decide we're going to keep 5 drafts and 10 major versions as an example. And then down here at the bottom of the UI is enforcing checkout. So let me zoom in so you can see all of that. So we've got enforcing checkout. Oops, I'm having trouble with my key. And version retention limits. So all of that is there in the UI. We can do similar things in PowerShell. So let's jump back to PowerShell and grab those settings and talk about how we would set those. And then we're going to roll all of this into a script. So in PowerShell, we can grab onto a site collection. Technically, it's called creating an object reference. And so I'm going to do this in a couple of steps here. No, we're just going to go straight to it. We're going to grab get sp site, http teams.contoso.com, teams tech days. So that variable now has grabbed onto, is an object reference to that site collection. And if we type the variable name, it shows us the default property of that site collection. Now, unlike a command prompt, in a command prompt, you're basically just dealing with text. In PowerShell, you're dealing with objects, which means that variable really, truly represents that site collection. It's got all of the properties, all of the capabilities, the methods of that site collection. And we can see that if we pipe that site collection to the select command and say, show us the name and I'm going to make sure I'm doing this right here. Whoops. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's the name and let's say the date. I'm sorry, I started heading down the wrong path with my demonstration there. Because what I really want to do was go down to that list, so excuse me on that. I was trying to show you the versioning thing, and I completely skipped it there. So what we want to do is we want to grab onto not the site, but the list that we were working with. So let me clear the screen and start this again. So we're going to, first, this is why I want to do this, grab onto the website, get spweb. We can then grab onto the site collection if we want to as well, which we've already done. And then we can grab onto the list. Now, a list and a library are effectively the same thing in SharePoint from an object perspective. They're all contained in a collection of lists. So the site object, which represents the whole site, has within it a property called lists. And this property is a list of all of the lists. So it's kind of what you get when you go to all site content. So we see all of the different lists and libraries here. In PowerShell, boy, I've really painted myself into a corner here. I'll try this again. Excuse me. We're going to get the website, because it's a property of the website, Teams Tech Days. All right, so the website has a property called lists, and we can grab onto it with the lists property and the name of the list, so shared documents. So basically what we've done here is we've said we've grabbed onto the website. In the website, we've gone in and found the list of lists, and we've created a variable that points to the specific list we're looking for. And it's done it with an index, which is in square brackets, and the name of the list or the index number of the list within those square brackets. So now that we've gotten that list, we can check and see if versions are enabled using the enable versioning property. So the list itself has an enable versioning property. Oh, that's interesting. Isn't that what we just set? What did I do wrong? Oh, I didn't click OK? That helps, doesn't it? Okay, well then let's just do it here. So we see that list, if I didn't click OK, that's why it's false. That would certainly explain it. We can set that to true. And we can do it from PowerShell. That's actually even a better demonstration there. And then we can update the list. Now let's go back and take a look at the Shared Documents document library, into library settings and versioning settings, and sure enough, we now have the versioning enabled. So we've got the ability to set versioning. We can also set checkout with the force checkout property. So again, list force checkout equals true. Now, one of the interesting things, if you're newer to PowerShell, about this process that we're going through here is we're operating on the variable. We're operating on the object reference. And when you change a property on an object reference, you almost always have to update that variable in order to drive the change back to the object itself. It's almost like you took a picture of the list, in this case, and you are changing what's in the picture, but then you haven't clicked Save yet. Because the reference is only in memory, and the update method is what allows you to force that change back into the original object itself. So if we come back to our UI and we hit refresh, we now see that versioning is enabled. So we're able to start grabbing onto those settings in our PowerShell commandlets. Now all we need to do is start putting all of these pieces into a script in order to start driving our provisioning. So let me pull up this script and we'll take a look through this here. Yeah, this is the one I wanted to show you. So in this case, we've got a script that is going to provision a specific site, and it's going to provision a site for the benefits analysis team. So we have a team of finance and human resources people who are evaluating benefits for next year. They are going to need a team site, and I've written a script that will create their team site. Now, obviously, you're not going to write a script to create one team site. That's crazy because it'd be faster to do it in the UI. But we're going to start with this as an example and grow it into a provisioning engine. So in this script, we're using the commands that we were just looking at. We see the new SP content database command. That creates a content database for this specific team, so it will be in its own content database. We then use the new SP site command to create the site collection. And then we set a couple of different properties here, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We go into the Shared Documents document library, we enable versioning and checkout, and we update it. And so we're just applying those commands into a script that we can then run. So far, so good conceptually? Make sense? Okay. Now, there's a couple of pieces in the middle here that I want to talk about because they're interesting and they relate to managing security and groups and users. And at the end of the day, we'll be doing a session specifically about user and group management, but I want to at least touch on it now. When you create a team site in the user interface, let's look at one that I created in the UI here. I created marketing. When you create a team site using the new site commandlet in the UI, what you get are these groups that most of you are probably quite familiar with. You get the owners group, which has full control, the members group, which has contribute, the visitors group, the visitors group, which has read, and each of those groups is preceded with the name of the site. So marketing owners, marketing visitors, marketing members. And that happens when you use the UI. When you use PowerShell to create a site collection, you don't automatically get those groups. You have to specify that you want those groups. And the way you do that is with the create default associated groups commandlet. So this is a crazy little commandlet. Let me zoom in so you can see the name. But that is what creates those default groups of members, visitors, and owners. So if you want those, you have to create those. What we also see in here let me find my, what I'm trying to find here. Yes, is the, we're grabbing the members group and we are adding the site collection administrator into it. This is something that I find is fairly useful as a sort of a best practice, and so let's just assume we've decided as an organization that we want to ensure that our primary administrator is a member of the group, or is in the members group, and we're also adding the primary site collection administrator to the viewers group. So the way we do those two things is we grab the site groups property of the web. So we have the web that we've just created. We are looking at the site groups list. And in that list, we pull out the specific group whose name is equivalent to the variable viewers group, which is here. So we're pulling out that one group, and then we're using the add user method to add the administrator into it. So this is just basically a 2-line command that adds that user into that specific group. So all of these things would not happen without specific commands in PowerShell, and these reflect the rules that we've set up in our organization that say we want these 3 default groups, we want the primary administrator to be in these 3 groups, and then we also are putting the, we're also setting a variable for the secondary administrator as well. So if we've done all this right, and like I said, I had a crash, so I can't guarantee, but we'll give it a shot, we should be able to run this script. Put it in the right place. We'll save the script as site provisioning.ps1. PowerShell scripts use the PS1 extension. And let's see what happens. All right, so the first step is the script starts creating the content database. Now, I have added lines in the script that put out text to keep us apprised of the status. So the script is telling us that it's creating the content database. It's telling us the name of the content database. And because we didn't get an error right away, I know it's working, which is good. And now it's creating the site collection within that content database. So it's now at this new SP site. This is kind of where it is right now. And it's finished. That's a good sign. Didn't get an error. So let's check it out. And the URL for this site is benefits. Teams. So we've got the site. Let's go check out the shared documents document library, library settings. Sure enough, versioning is enabled, checkout is enforced, and let's go to our permissions. And we see that we do have the 3 groups. And let's take a look at who is a member of those groups. We should see SP admin is in each of those groups. Oops, that's not the one he's in. Viewers. Okay, so this particular script has worked, and this is sort of the thing I like to do as a first step in this process is take the rules that I've determined are what I need to enforce from a business logic perspective, and create a script that creates a static object. And this is purely just for testing and making sure that the logic is right. And making sure that the commandlets are being used correctly, and that the permissions are there that you need, and all of those good things to just do something for your environment. Now, one of the obvious questions here is how do you learn how to implement the various policies you need in PowerShell? Where are the resources for that? And the answer, luckily, is on the internet. If you go out to Bing or Google or your favorite search engine and start searching for what you're trying to do, you're going to find answers. These days, there's a lot of rich PowerShell information out there. If you use the keyword PowerShell and SharePoint plus the task you are trying to achieve, you will find pieces of PowerShell documented that tell you what you're trying to do. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. I pulled these down in advance rather than searching for them, but let's take a look here. So one of them is managing auditing settings. We might have a governance requirement that we need to enable specific auditing settings on our environment. Doing a search for PowerShell SharePoint auditing brought me to this script that shows me how to set auditing for a list in this case. So this gives me a piece of code that I can pull into my own script to do what I need it to do. And this particular author does a great job of explaining how the script works, making the script actually quite elegant. It's well crafted. And as you work more with PowerShell on the line, you'll start finding those authors who really do a good job of explaining to you. Because one author's style might work for you but might not work for me, you'll start finding those that work for you. Personally, I think that certainly Gary Lapointe, who's one of the sort of uber guru MVPs for PowerShell and SharePoint, does an awesome job. Anything by him I can pretty much assume will be good. And you'll start finding the authors that you trust for your specific tasks. If we've got some time, we'll actually come back and pull this into our script to extend what we're doing in our environment. So we've got a script that is capable now of generating a static object. It proves that we can do it, that we can access the properties that we need. Now we need to think about how we are going to turn this into an automated tool. Now, the first thing we need to think about is the whole process that we're trying to automate. The whole process is a user realizes they need a site for their team. And currently, they call the help desk and say, I need a site. Probably the help desk has to go through some process to figure out whether they're allowed to ask for one. There needs to be some kind of approval. And then the help desk pulls out a tool and actually creates the site. We are probably not giving our users permissions to create the site directly, right? Now, there is a feature called self-service site creation. How many of you actually use that? Wow, a few brave folks. So at the web app level, you can turn on self-service site creation. The problem with self-service site creation is you get all the defaults. So your new site is not going to have checkout enforced, not going to have version retention limits set, not going to reflect the security roles that you want to configure. So it's good for very limited scenarios, but for most scenarios, you're trying to inject some business logic. If you were to empower users to create sites and then expect them to go into the user interface and turn on all the different settings, we all know that probably wouldn't happen. So what we want to do is enforce the business logic, which means the user is only allowed to ask for what they need. The business logic then ensures it is done the way our governance requires, and that is done at a different credential than the users. Right now in the human process, it's the help desk that is taking that request in, and with the help desk credentials, driving that into the service. So there's a break in credentials between the request for the task and the execution of the task. And we need to reflect that in our automated architecture as well. In our automated architecture, we want the request to come from the user, and then we want the execution to be done with administrative credentials. And one way to do this is to create this separation of credentials is to run your script with elevated credentials, perhaps as a scheduled task even. Now, if I were doing this as a developer, I might even create a Windows service that takes in requests and executes those requests. As an IT pro, I can create scheduled tasks. And scheduled tasks can be set to run with specific credentials. And one of the great things about using a scheduled task and automating this process is not only can I take requests from users and make sure that they're being done correctly, but now I can actually undelegate my help desk. I can actually take the help desk's ability to create sites away from them and ask them to use the same process, which then ensures that my help desk is doing it correctly as well. Because I can tell you, as many times as users make mistakes creating sites, I see just as many help desk people making mistakes and not following the business logic. The business has this whole procedure and they miss step 12, and suddenly there's a security problem. So by creating a break in credentials, that will help us a lot. So where we're going to aim for is having a request engine that is supported for the user. And once that user's request is ready to be processed, we'll have a script running with elevated credentials that executes that request. Does that architecture make sense? Okay, so let's start with the user side of things. We're going to want the user to create a request. We're going to need to collect some data from them. And then we might even want to have some kind of approval workflow. Now, what tool will allow us to get a user to submit a request and do a workflow? It sounds like SharePoint, huh? It's a great way to use SharePoint. Is let's use SharePoint to automate SharePoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our team site, and I've already started this process here to make sure that at least part of it worked. And we're going to create a site provisioning request tool in SharePoint itself. So teams.contoso.com is where our team sites are. So this URL is the top URL for all of our team sites, and then underneath that we have a managed path called Teams, we have a managed path called Departments, and we have a managed path called Projects. But teams.contoso.com is where it all starts. So this is the root site. Now at this root site, I would like to have a directory of projects and teams that's dynamically maintained. That would be another thing that would be very nice to have, and if we have time, we'll work on that too. But this is also where it makes sense to create a provisioning request. So we create a new list. So we'll create a new custom list. I did this right during lunch again, since I had a crash, and so it's already created here. The list is called Site Request. Let's add this to our quick launch bar so it's easy to get to. And in this list, we are going to collect the data that we need from the user in order to support their business request. Now, I'm going to be a little bit verbose here. Some of these things you could probably derive rather than asking the user for it, but just for the sake of example, I'm gonna do it all here. So we've got a couple of columns. We've got a title, which will be the actual name of the site, the sort of user-friendly name of the site. Then we've got a site name, and this will be part of the URL of the site. And then we want the business to tell us who the administrator for the site should be. And we're only going to ask for one. We're going to ask for one site collection administrator as a starting point, because our governance specifies that the SP admin account should always be the other site collection administrator. That helps for a number of reasons. So the two site collection owners are the SP admin account and a business user. And then we'll add other site collection administrators perhaps into the site collection administrators group of the site in order to provide them full control of content and settings. Moving down our list of columns here, we have the display name for the site collection administrator and the email address. And then we've got a status column that we'll come back to in just a minute. So we're basically creating, we're basically asking the user to submit these pieces. So let's create a new request. We'll call this Tech Days 2. And we'll say that April M, is our site collection administrator. You know what, let me make sure that that's her username. Something tells me it might not be. It's April Meyer. Yes, okay. Her display name and her email address. And again, those could probably be derived in several different ways. They could be derived in several different ways. But working with them right now as plain text is simpler. And we have the status column that we'll keep there, requested. And now let's take a look at how we will actually grab onto those values and use them in our PowerShell script. So at some point in the future, our PowerShell script is going to run, and we're going to want to read this list and get those variables to drive the provisioning of our site. So let's go into our script here. Okay, and this ends up being pretty easy. The first couple of lines you might be able to recognize from what we were doing earlier. So let me zoom in and show you these. We grab onto the web of the top-level site of our team site collection. So we're grabbing onto that teams.contoso.com website, and then we're going into its lists and grabbing the list called site requests. So those first few lines there are simply grabbing onto the list that contains our requests. In that list, there are a lot of items. Each item in the list is stored in the items property of the list. And so we're assigning all of the items to the variable called items. So at this point, this variable contains our entire list, basically. Then we take the items in the list and we put them through a for each. And for each is a really powerful statement that allows us, or commandlet in this case, that allows us to loop through each of the items in the list and do things to them. So at this point, we've grabbed onto the list and are starting to look at each item. Does that make sense so far? Okay. And this is pretty much template. You could. There's nothing wrong with using this code until you get to a giant list where this starts to be a little bit less efficient. I mentioned about that earlier. Now, as we go through each item in the list, each item is represented by the $_ variable, which represents the current variable in the pipeline, and we assign that to a variable called item. So at this point, this variable is a really important one. This represents the current item that we are looping through. And that item is the row. And each field shows up like this: the title column of the current item, the site name column of the current item, the administrator column of the current item, et cetera, et cetera. And all we're doing here is assigning the values from those columns to a new variable. So the title column goes into a variable called title, the site name column goes into a variable called site name, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And notice there's one other thing I've done here, which is in the list, the administrator is specified only with their logon name, but PowerShell needs that to be contoso /. It needs to have the domain name syntax. And so in the script, we're taking the administrator column, assigning it to the variable called admin, and then we're using that variable here and prepending it with contoso to create a new variable called admin. So we're basically creating a variable that is equal to contoso / the name of the original column to make it work for us. All of the other columns, and that's sort of an example of deriving information. So whatever the user gives you, you can sort of twist around in the PowerShell script, make it what you need. So by the time we're here, we now have variables. Whoops. I'm doing bad drawing there. We have variables that represent each column in our list. So far, so good? Okay. Now we are going to cycle through the list and we're going to use those variables. So if we go down here a little bit further, we start seeing those same commandlets that we started out with: new SP content database, new site, that are using the variables that have been created along the way. So we see the website name, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the rest of this script is very much the same as the static script that we used before. But now, instead of hardwiring the variables, which we did before, you might remember that before we hardwired all of the variables in the bottom half of the screen here. Now we are grabbing the variables from a SharePoint list. We're cycling through, and at this last bracket here, this goes back and gets the next item and loops through it again. So we're iteratively going through and creating our structure out of that site. Questions so far? Okay. Now, one of the things that will happen is, as we go through this, once a site has been created, we don't want to try and create it again because we'll get an error. So we're going to need to have some way of ensuring that we only do this once per request. And there is built into this loop exactly that kind of logic. So as we are going through each item in the list, one of the things we're doing is we're looking at the status column. And only if the status column is approved, meaning the request has been approved, do we actually create the site. So this is a key piece of logic here that ensures that we only are going to do this once if the column is marked approved. And at the end of the process, after we've actually created the site, we're changing the status column to be completed. So the next time when we look at that row, the status is going to be completed and we won't try and recreate the site. So that's a very important piece of this loop, is that we're only doing it if the request has been approved, and when we succeed, we're going to mark it to completed so that we don't try again. So that's why we have the status column in the list. If we go back to our site request list, we can see requested, and then once it is approved, it will actually get executed, and then it gets marked as completed, and it won't get used again. Make sense? All right. Now we get to use all the power of SharePoint to figure out how a request goes from being requested to being approved. And so this would be standard standard SharePoint usage. You create a workflow, you open SharePoint Designer, and you say, okay, when a user, when status equals requested, we notify the manager has to approve it, and then status gets changed to approved. We do whatever workflow stuff you would do in SharePoint to automate your business process and change that status column to approved. So let's assume that, let me take a quick look at the time here. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip the workflow part because we're going to run out of time otherwise. But the workflow is just a workflow. It's not specific to this session. So let's assume that we have these requests that have come in, and the manager has approved this one. So using whatever workflow we've created, this has become approved. And now we're going to run that script with elevated credentials. Now, we'll come back and talk about that piece in a few minutes, but it would be creating a scheduled task. For now, we're going to run the script manually to make sure that it works. And I think that there's a bug in this script right now that I wasn't able to fix during lunch, so we might get a little error, but it's going to do most of what it needs to do. So we run the provisioning site script, cross our fingers, and it starts to do its work. So notice it's creating a content database called TechDays2. So we know that it saw the site name as TechDays2. It seems to have grabbed onto the list. Notice it didn't create one for Team 1 or Team 2 because those weren't approved, so we know that that logic is working as well. It's now creating the site collection, so that's a good sign. And then there's something still buggy in the creation of the groups. And this was something I couldn't solve during lunch. So there'll be one error that comes up here, I think. Yeah, so there's some error. Let's just take a quick look at lines 49 and 51, trying to add users to the group. So on the two places where it's adding the users to the group, it's saying that there's a null, which means for some reason the way it's constructing the primary admin is not working. So the primary admin isn't getting grabbed onto it, so it's not getting added to the group successfully, and I'll have to troubleshoot that later. But that's not a killer. So now let's go and look, first of all, at this list. This was our request list before we ran the script. Let's refresh. Notice it's completed now. And obviously, one of the other things we could do is we could have the script putting information into the list, new information about when the script ran, perhaps, maybe some additional information if there was an error. So we could be populating this list with management information. So this list actually not only becomes a request list, it becomes an inventory for us of sites and when they were created and maybe policies associated with them. We could be feeding information back into this list. Now let's check and see how the site was created. And let's find out what errors we see in the site itself. So this is teams.contoso.com/teams/tech-days2. And we see the site has been created. We can then go into the Shared Documents document library, into its settings, and we can find out that versioning was enabled and documents checkout has been enforced. So that piece of business logic has been enforced successfully. And then we can go to the site settings, site permissions. We see it did create the default groups, so that's good. And this is where the error was. For some reason, it's not putting the primary site collection administrator in there, which isn't actually the end of the world from a practical perspective. It just doesn't meet my business requirements. So we've got most of the script working quite well. And now the final step in this is to handle the elevation of credentials. to try to set it up so that maybe that our users that our user requests can be processed automatically, and maybe even we can get our help desk out of the middle of this and ensure that they do things correctly when they create sites too. So this is effectively a matter of simply creating a scheduled task to run that script. Now this is one of those things I like to have working before the session because there are a few things that I tend to forget on this, but we'll give it a shot. So let me first of all get rid of the task I created earlier. Let's start from scratch. We're going to create a task. We'll call the task SharePoint Site Provisioning. The name doesn't matter. And we get to choose when this task runs. Now this is one of those weird things about the task scheduler that hopefully I'll explain well here, which is if we want the task to run every hour, what we actually choose is one time, which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But you'll see why in just a minute. We set a starting time. Now my computer looks like it is not in our time zone. Let's see what time zone it's in. Pacific, Eastern. So it's still on the East Coast, so it's almost 8 o'clock in New York. And what I'm going to try and do to see if we can get this to work is I'm going to set the task to run just a few minutes from now. So we'll set it to run at, let's say, 7:58. And we'll see how fast we can make this work. And what we want to do is, at that time, we want to start a program. And the program we want to start is PowerShell.exe. And then specifically, we want to run C:\\scripts/provision sites.ps1. Okay, so we've got about 20 seconds left, and during that 20 seconds, I'm going to also point out that, let's see if I can find this here. Actually, let's just let it run here, see if it works. Oof. Didn't run. Oh, it's going to wait till 41 seconds. Let's give it a minute, see if it happens here. Okay, well, at least it ran. There was a lot of red there, which is not a good sign. Let's see if we can figure out why there's a lot of red. What was that? That's true. I don't have any approved, and so it should not have done anything, but it did give me a lot of red. So let me see if I can. Sorry? Everything would be null except for the fact that it goes through the list items and it only tries to do something if there is something that's approved. So there's something else going wrong. Let's take a quick look, and if we can't solve this, I'll post the answer later because it's not critical to the learning in the session. But let's take a quick look here. Sorry? Execution policy would be the same for a scheduled task as it is as I'm running the script manually. So that's a good question, and I'll bring that up for folks. But what was that? That's exactly what it is. That's what it is for sure. So what is happening is that this commandlet is using all of the SharePoint commandlets, and this script doesn't load the SharePoint snap-in that is required in order to run these commands. So let's take a quick step back, and thank you very much. That was a PowerShell 101 thing that I'm missing there. So if we run PowerShell.exe, we cannot do anything with SharePoint. So if we try get sp site, we're not going to get anything because PowerShell doesn't even know what that commandlet is. PowerShell is a framework into which functionality is added by snap-ins and modules, and we need to load the SharePoint snap-in. So let me dive into I want to pull up the, okay, I'm jet lagging here, so give me a second. All right, so the PowerShell snap-in we're going to need is Windows, Microsoft.PowerShell.SharePoint, right? Microsoft SharePoint.PowerShell. And so what we are going to do is add that snap-in in the script. Now let me make sure that I've typed this correctly, because with an 11-hour time difference, there's no guarantee. Okay, there we go. And once you've added that snap-in, then all of the PowerShell command lists for SharePoint start to work. Now this is definitely a shortcut, so this is absolutely one of those things that's not elegant. And if you go into in any PowerShell sample script, what you will find is a couple lines of code that you put at the beginning of any PowerShell script for SharePoint that says, first, is the snap-in loaded? If not, load the snap-in. So there's a little bit of conditional logic that just says, if we need it, let's load it. That absolutely has to be in this script, because the script we're running is not running the PowerShell, is not running the SharePoint PowerShell console. It's running the normal PowerShell console, so we have to do this thing. So that should fix that error. Let's run the script and see. Good. Now we have the other problem, which was simply that none of the tasks were approved. So the script is now running. Let's create one more approval. It should create a team site for Team 2. And while it's doing that, let me pull up the property sheet that I wanted to show you. So while that's doing that, if we go into the task properties of this task, I mentioned that it's a really strange thing about scheduled tasks in Windows, that if you want something to run every hour, you actually choose one time. And then in the properties of that trigger, which is a one-time trigger, you edit that and you can say, let's repeat this task every whatever you want it to be. So we can say every 5 minutes, for example. So whatever the case is, let's do it for every hour. We can set the process, and there's lots of other properties in here obviously as well, but we can set the exact schedule and conditions under which we want this provisioning script to run. So we've now got all of the pieces in place. We have PowerShell commandlets that get things done. We'll put them into a script that runs as a scheduled task under higher credentials to process requests that are being entered on a SharePoint site under normal user credentials, and that SharePoint site then provides all of the workflow, metadata management, and other pieces that we need to enable management of our environment. So now data can come in, and that data doesn't necessarily have to all be just about settings in the site. One of the common data points that I like to encourage organizations to gather when they're doing a site request is gather the business owner of the site, or owners, because that's not necessarily the same person who's going to be the site collection administrator. And when you are working in the SharePoint UI, there's really no place in SharePoint where you can log who the business owner is. You really have the site collection administrators. When you're creating your own database, you can now collect the business owner or owners, as well as the site collection administrator and the site owners, and whatever other information you need, like at what point should this site be expired? Maybe that's a piece of information that governance wants you to collect. It may not be a required field, but it may be that you ask users for it so that if they know their project is going to be done in 6 months, you now have the option of archiving that more effectively. Then you have another script that runs every night that looks for sites that were created 6 months ago and have an expiration date of 6 months. So in other words, their expiration date has hit. And that script archives that site, backs it up, and deletes it from your SharePoint environment. So the more data you can get into this system and the more scripts you can create to automate the processes that you otherwise are having to do automatically, the more it frees you to keep investing in this kind of infrastructure. So you can start really focus on being proactive and creative and ensuring that your policies are being met in a proactive manner rather than having to do it every moment in the UI and at the operational level. So those are the pieces that we put together for this kind of infrastructure. Now, I'd like to spend a few moments talking about some notes about this. Let me just pull up a slide just so we have something on the video. The pieces we've put together are the right pieces for a provisioning engine. They are a request queue, a database of requests at which users can be allowed the ability to enter a request. So user has had the ability to write into that list. Then there's a workflow component that we didn't focus on, but that's standard SharePoint workflow that potentially allows you to modify that request and get it from a state of requested to approved. Then there's an elevation point where the requested tasks are processed with elevated credentials. Now, one piece we didn't cover was the feedback loop, which is incorporating into that script things that add items or add data back into that list that provide information to did it work, how many times did we try, and maybe if we tried 5 times, we don't try again because something must be wrong with the infrastructure. That kind of feedback needs to be there. And then obviously making the scripts more elegant, making them more scalable, so that if you are in an environment that has tens of thousands of team sites, you'll want to ensure that your memory is being utilized correctly on the scripts and all those kinds of things. And then the one other component that we didn't talk about in this particular session, but is easy to learn how to do on the web, is remoting. So in PowerShell 2.0, which is now available with SharePoint 2010, you've got the ability to run PowerShell scripts remotely. And that is probably what you're going to be doing in this kind of scenario. You're not going to necessarily be running these scheduled tasks on your SharePoint farm. You could. There's no reason not to. You can run it on one server, for example. But you might also have a provisioning server somewhere or have it built into one of your other services where that server is running the scripts remotely against your SharePoint farm. In order to do PowerShell remoting, it's a very easy setup. You basically enable remoting on the server, the SharePoint server, because that's where all of the DLLs and commandlets and snap-ins are loaded. And then on the server that's running the script, you add a couple of easy lines of code that establish what's called a session. And it's effectively a remote desktop session. It's just a remote PowerShell session that's connecting. And then all of the commands that are running in the script run in the context of that session, so they actually are executing and affecting the SharePoint server itself. So the remoting would be sort of one last component of that. Now, once you get into remoting, you run into one potential other obstacle that someone brought up, which is your execution policy. By default, PowerShell scripts are not allowed to run. For security measures, Microsoft sets what's called an execution policy of restricted, which means a script has to be signed digitally in order to run. And what would be a good security practice would be to actually digitally sign your script, and then it would run under a restricted policy. But many IT pros don't go that distance, and they decide to take a shortcut and not sign their scripts. In that case, you can lower the execution policy, and you can say, okay, I'm going to allow scripts to run that aren't signed, but only if they're stored on this machine, so that someone doesn't somehow manage to run a script from the network or, gosh forbid, the internet. So those have to be signed, but the local scripts can be unsigned, and that's called that's a local unrestricted policy. So if you're doing remoting, your server will need to have your policy adjusted to ensure that it matches the types of scripts you're running. In this case, we didn't have to change the policy because on the SharePoint server itself, when you install SharePoint, it lowers the execution policy to allow locally unsigned scripts. But if you are doing remoting, you'll need to worry about that execution policy as well. So all these pieces put together create a provisioning engine. All the concepts are there. It ends up being secure because of the tiers you've got. There is no way a user can actually create a site in your environment. The only thing that can create the site is the script, and the only reason someone can use a script is because they had permissions to create a request. So you've got all the right security hoops in place to make this work as a provisioning engine. And if you're a developer, you take the exact same concepts and you can go to the next level, which is perhaps building very sophisticated workflows inside of SharePoint. You could make the task request portal be something other than SharePoint. It could just be an ASP.NET web application. And instead of using a PowerShell script running with elevated credentials as a scheduled task, you could create a Windows service that's running every particular period of time based on service configuration. So you can elevate this up all the way to really truly an application level, and the only restriction you've got is the capabilities of SharePoint itself that are exposed to automation. So anything that SharePoint allows you to touch, you can automate in this way. Unfortunately, there are some things that SharePoint just can't do that you would need third parties to do, and then you'll need to automate their tools. Just as an example, SharePoint doesn't do full fidelity granular backups and restores. It does partial fidelity, partial granular backups and restores. There are several third-party tools that go the extra distance and allow full fidelity, granular restore and backup. So if you want to automate those kinds of tasks, you're going to need those tools underneath you to do what SharePoint can't do. But all of the pieces are here for you. Does this seem like it makes sense? I hope the concepts are there and will help you go the distance with it, I hope. I will post these scripts. In fact, let me put up the URL for the scripts here. And if you wrote this down at the end of the last session, it's going to be the exact same URL for the slides and for the last session, so if you might already have it. It's bit.ly. And bit.ly URLs are case sensitive, by the way, so this is all lowercase, 2012, February 15th. So that is my SkyDrive folder for this event. I will be putting the slides and the script snippets that I used at that URL. It'll probably be tonight or tomorrow morning that I get up there. It won't be right away, but they will be up there for you. My email address is available for you guys, so don't hesitate to write me if you've got questions or need pointers on this. Microsoft will have the recording of this session, so you can review it and sort of follow through with your, sort of treat it as a lab if you want to. And my goal really is to help you automate as many of these processes as possible. I want you to be focused on good architecture and on responding to business needs rather than on clicking through the interface every time a user wants something done. So I hope this was helpful. I would love your feedback. As I said, this is a brand new session, so I want to continue improving it. If you've got good examples that you've created, I would love to see them, if you don't mind sharing them. And if you've got any questions, I'll stick around after the session to answer questions. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and let the recording finish, and then if we can keep the mic on, I can answer questions at least. Is that cool? All right. So are there any questions? Yeah. Good question. So the site collection administrators have to be users. You can't nest into the site collection administrators group. Now you can only have 2 owners, but you can have as many site collection administrators as you want. It's just a matter of how you do it in PowerShell. So when the commandlets we were using attack the owners, but there are sample scripts out there for how you take a user and flag them as a site collection administrator in your site collection itself. So you can take 15 different users and make them site collection administrators. And in the next session, I'm going to show you some concepts of how you tie a group in Active Directory to a group in SharePoint in such a way that when you add users to the group in Active Directory, they get added to the group in SharePoint. And that kind of thing would allow you to achieve what you're talking about, where you can add a user to a group in Active Directory and they end up a site collection administrator. But it's really because you're taking that user and adding them in both places. But you can't nest into the site collection administrators group. All the other things you can, but not that. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
About deployment between environments like development,
yes.
and production.
Yes.
So we can develop features and deploy them,
Mm-hmm.
provision something in PowerShell, any other tools?
Yeah, okay, this is a good question. Someone asked me this question before lunch as well about deployment of solutions. Out of the box with SharePoint, you've got your test, dev, and QA and production farms. It's very tough to get things from point A to point B. Especially if your production farm is already running and you're going back and making a tweak and needing to get that back into production. That's really, really, really hard. The Microsoft solution to that is creating solution packages in Visual Studio that then can be easily deployed between environments. But a lot of times that's overkill because you might have many situations where a user is trying to create a workflow or an extra content type or something like that, and you want them to go into your test environment and do it before they do it in production. And having to call up a developer to package that is a little extreme. So there, in my experience, there are really kind of two solutions. The first is PowerShell, figuring out how to actually automate it in both environments. But again, if a user is just adding a column, that PowerShell may even be a little overkill. And the other is third-party tools. Unfortunately, this is one of those scenarios that just isn't super clean at this point in SharePoint, and there are third parties. The only one I know is ours. AvePoint has a tool called Deployment Manager that's specifically for this scenario. There might be others out there, but I don't look at our competitors in that specific space. Deployment Manager's job is not just to deploy solutions with workflows and stuff, but also to allow you to deploy components like a content type, a style sheet, a list item, or a list column. So things that aren't solutions. So AvePoint or DocAv Deployment Manager would be one of the tools that would help you solve that.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Yeah.
When we're talking about governance, you are talking also about SLA. And in a little way of thinking of stuff, we should manage that in a kind of CMDB, or configuration management database with process. At which granularity do you propose to manage these kind of artifacts? Do we have to put in the CMDB every team site because they have to be followed in the governance, or the farm is maybe a better niveau?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. His question is basically, at what level of granularity do you want to be tracking management information? And so management information would include, for example, our team sites that we've created here. I think there are several answers to that question. One is it has to be based on your business requirements, so that's the easy consultant answer. The second answer is I want to track as much as I possibly can. Because if I'm tracking it, that gives me the ability to automate it. If there's no database, I can't be automating it. So I'd like to have as much information as I possibly can. So I would prefer to have tons of information because then I can branch out and use it in other interesting functional ways. For example, I would really like to turn this into custom navigation so that I can go to my root team site and get a directory of all the team sites that exist, which I could actually pull directly off of this list of just simply by filtering what's been completed and adding a URL field to it. That's a calculated value. So there's so many, not just administrative benefits of tracking this kind of information, but functional benefits that I think I would like to know what's there in as much detail as I possibly can. But it's gonna, there's risks and rewards of capturing the information and costs and benefits. So it does depend on requirements. But I would certainly get every site collection. There's a lot because if nothing else, you want business owners of content. You want to know who to really call if an approval needs to happen or whatever. And being able to track that metadata is hugely valuable. Being able to track when it was created, why it was created, and when it can be deleted. Other questions? All right, super. So just a quick review. At the end of the day, the last slot, I'm doing a session on user and group management. It will focus on broad questions like should you nest an Active Directory or not. We'll look at some role-based management concepts that, again, will take PowerShell into provisioning groups from Active Directory into SharePoint. And then tomorrow, there is a parallel event in this facility for students who are getting ready to go into the business world. And at 10:45, I've got a session on that's called CSI IT, Who Killed IT, I think it's the title. And it's all about why the cloud and SharePoint and devices and consumerization have completely changed our world in IT and how we have to build new processes and governance into IT itself. So that's the business side of governance, and that'll be 10:45 tomorrow morning. I'm not exactly sure right off the top of my head which room, but if you're around tomorrow, I would highly recommend that session as well. So thank you guys very much. See you, some of you this afternoon, and have a great day. Thank you.